There's a book that Ken Griffin recommends reading. It's called Hardball. And the subtitle of that book is Are You Playing to Play? Or Are You Playing to Win? It is a book about extreme winners and some of the best operators in business. And there's a line in that book that sounds like it could have been written by any of the almost 400 historically great founders that you and I have studied on this podcast so far. It says, if you have not examined your costs in detail, it is very likely that there exists, lurking somewhere in your cost structure, a major opportunity to improve your profits, weaken your competitors, and expand your influence. The first move is to drive down your costs faster than your competitors can and use that savings to upset their strategies. 2 weeks ago, I told you about Todd Graves, who owns 90% of his business, over 90% of his business. That is a business that's worth at least $10 billion and is still growing at 30% a year. Todd Graves is obsessed about staying in the details of his business, just like Ken Griffin is obsessed about staying in the details of his business. And Todd said that some of the most successful, or all of the most successful people he knows, stays in the detail of their business. He mentioned learning from one of his friends who runs a multi-billion-dollar shipping company, and how that friend would even pay attention to how much his business was spending on bottled water. When I read that section, I thought it'd be a lot easier to do that if that shipping company was running on ramp. Something a lot of history's greatest founders have in common: they know their business from A to Z and their costs down to the penny. Ramp makes doing this effortless. Ramp gives you easy to use corporate cards for your entire team, automated expense reporting, and cost control. These corporate cards are fully programmable. You can set limits so the spending of your team never gets out of hand. Most companies only find out about excessive spending after the fact, just like that shipping company with the rampant spending on water. With Ramp, you stop it before it happens. Matt Paulson, who listens to founders and is the founder of this company called MarketBeat, recently switched to Ramp, and this is what he said about it. Ramp is the best. The amount of money you will save from unwanted renewals and employees who think company credit card equals I can buy whatever I want will far exceed the best credit card rewards program. Matt is talking about the importance of cost control. There is a line in Andrew Carnegie's autobiography that says cost control became nearly an obsession. All of history's greatest founders were the same way. Ramp helps you make this an obsession. If Andrew Carnegie was alive today, he'd run his business on Ramp. Make history's greatest entrepreneurs proud by going to ramp.com, and you will see why many of the world's top founders are running their business on Ramp. Go to ramp.com to learn how they can help your business today. That is ramp.com. I had a lot of fun making this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. As head trader at Enron when it filed for bankruptcy, I received many calls from firms that were recruiting. I was busy trying to close out the trading book and wanted to take some time to decide my future, so I didn't take any meetings. But Citadel was by far the most aggressive. Other companies set up a few interviews with Enron's senior people. Citadel interviewed everyone in the trading operation at all functions and all levels. Citadel's team called me twice, but I declined to meet. It was apparent to me that their intent was to reverse engineer their business, and I wasn't going to help them. They knew that people looking for a job, particularly if they didn't have a fiduciary responsibility to a current employer, would be very free with info. Interview everyone and you get a 360-degree perspective of the industry, how the business makes money, its competitive edge, who the best employees are, etc. Citadel probably interviewed several hundred Enron employees. Much more importantly, they built the framework for how to enter the energy business, which, as Ken has said, has been an enormous success. I did eventually talk with Citadel. On their third call to me, they asked if I would talk to Ken directly. I was at that point heading to Aspen for a quick industry event. I didn't know Ken personally, but I had great respect for what he had built, so I told his rep that he could call me when I got back to Houston the following week. She said great, but then she called back a few minutes later with a question. If Ken flew to Aspen to meet me in person the next day, would I? Out of respect, I said of course. The next day, I had a great meeting with him, and later that week, he offered me a job as head gas trader. I wanted to fully run an operation and thought there was more upside if I could have my own fund, so I declined. I ended up building my own firm, starting with traders and hiring deep fundamentals expertise. Citadel started with research, as is their DNA, and built up a trading operation around it. Both models worked fabulously well. I came away from the experience with an even deeper respect for both Ken and Citadel. and remain friends with him to this day. I started with a niche, gas trading, built a niche fund, and burnt out after 17 years. Ken started with a niche, Convert Arb, and built one of the most successful financial firms ever and has never tired. That was a tweet written by John Arnold. I came across it a few weeks ago, and it further piqued my interest on making an episode about Ken Griffin. There's no biographies, there's no books written about him, but I keep coming across these little clues that he's a very special person, that tweet being one of them. I want to pick up this book that I read many years ago for the first time, probably 5 or 6 years ago. It's by this guy named Ed Thorp. I've done a few episodes on him, but the one I would recommend listening to is episode 222. Ed Thorp is a legit genius. He was the person that he founded the very first quantitative hedge fund. He built the world's first wearable computer with Claude Shannon. He was the one that came up with the strategy and the process to beat the blackjack dealers in Vegas, and wrote a book about it that sold like millions of copies in the 1960s. His autobiography reads like a thriller, and he constantly pops up in all these important events in financial history. Let me give you an example. He has dinner with Warren Buffett when Warren Buffett's 38 years old. Ed Thorp, I think, is 35 at the time. He leaves the dinner, gets in the car, tells his wife, I think that man's going to be the richest person in America one day. But there's also a very interesting thing towards the end of the book that I'm going to read to you real quick, where a 19-year-old Ken Griffin comes to Ed Thorp's house. So he had closed down, by this time, Ed had closed down his hedge fund called Princeton Newport Partners. And so he says, if I would have kept going, how big could have that idea have gotten, right? He's like, there's no really way to know, but there is an interesting anecdote, and I have a story for you. And he says, amazingly enough, a market-neutral hedge fund operation was built on the Princeton Newport model, Citadel. It was started in 1990 in Chicago by former hedge fund manager Frank Meyer when he discovered this young quantitative investment prodigy, Ken Griffin, who was then trading options and convertible bonds from his Harvard dorm room. I met with Frank and Ken, outlining the workings and profit centers of Princeton Newport Partners, as well as turning over cartons of documents outlining in detail the terms and conditions of older outstanding warrants and convertible bonds. These were very valuable because they were no longer available. Citadel grew from a humble start in 1990, and he says, I became its first limited partner. So that adds to, Ed Thorp's financial lore. He's the first LP in Citadel. He also starts buying Buffett stock at like $600 a share. And so through my normal reading and research that I do for this podcast, I keep coming across all these like anecdotes and these stories of Ken Griffin, and I just couldn't figure out a way to make an episode on him. So I was like, okay, if there's no book, I'm going to listen to every single interview or talk that he's given. Most of the talks and the interviews that he gives, they're very topical. As you know, like, I'm not interested in topical, I'm interested in timeless. And so I was able to find a talk that Ken Griffin gave at Yale about a year or two ago that I feel has timeless principles. He kind of lays out, a very brief overview of his career. And so what I did is I transcribed that interview, and then I went through the transcription just like I go through the books. So underlining, notes, highlights, everything that I do. And then I'm going to jump into that right now. But there's another reason that I wanted to cover him. Because of the podcast, I get to meet a lot of wildly successful people. And I always ask them the same questions, like, who's the smartest person you know? What's the best business you know? And if they're in finance and they're talking about people that are still operating, Ken Griffin's name comes up over and over again. And there's two ways that he's been described to me many, many times. And it's funny that these people don't know each other, but they describe him the same way. They say winner and they say killer. And one thing that I think is true is if you just listen to the books that people recommend and you read them, you have a kind of a deeper fundamental understanding of how they think. And so there is, in this talk at Yale, he recommends a few books. And one of them is this book that I've heard that he makes people at Citadel, or strongly recommends people at Citadel read. It's really hard to find. It's out of print. It's called Hardball. Are you playing to play or playing to win? And so in addition to listening to every single interview I could find about Ken, reading everything I could find online about him, I also read this book. I may do a bonus episode in a few days on this. I'm not sure if I have enough material to do an episode. If I do, obviously release it on this feed. But I do want to just give you an insight into his mindset, which he's going to talk about in this talk through Yale. I think you got the hint when you saw his reaction to the Enron bankruptcy, that he was just, him and Citadel were by far more relentless. Everybody knew there was valuable information up for grabs, like who went the furthest. I'm very interested in these people that play at a different level. It looks like we're all playing the same game. And essentially the book is talking about, it's like, oh, from the outside, It may seem that we're all playing the same game, but there's certain companies and certain founders that take it to a completely different level. So I just want to read one paragraph for you from the book Hardball, and then I promise I'm going to jump into the rest is all being Ken's words. But it says, this kind of winning through competitive advantage may sound like nothing more than good, serious, and sensible business practice. But hardball companies are further distinguished by their attitude and behavior. They play with such a total commitment to the game, such a fierceness of execution, and such a relentless drive to maximize their strengths that they look very different from other companies that have admirable performance and sound business skills. I think of these few sentences when I read that tweet, that anecdote, that story from John Arnold. Hardball players play to win in every aspect of the game. It's like, oh yeah, Ken, I'm a big fan. Call me next week. How about I fly to where you are the next day? That's a different level. They always seek decisive victory. Sounds like exactly in that story. They don't want to win 2-1. They would prefer a 9-2 route. Okay, so that is the book Hardball. I will leave a link down below. I think there's a few copies left on Amazon, but it is, I bought a few for friends as well, but it is sometimes difficult to find. Okay, I want to go right into Ken's own words. And he starts to talk. Keep in mind, he's being interviewed at Yale. He's talking to a bunch of, college students. And his big thing is like, you need to be seeking risk. Remember last week with Todd Graves, he talked about, that guy owns 90% of a business that's worth at least $10 billion. And he's growing at 30% a year. So, his net worth is skyrocketing. And his whole point was like, he believes that entrepreneurs need to have way higher risk tolerance, that his risk tolerance, and you heard it on the podcast, was sky high. And this is the advice that Ken is giving to these students at Yale. I tell this to everybody. You should be risk seeking at this point in your life. So keep in mind, Ken started Citadel right out of college. This is a great moment to think about pursuing opportunities that have the maximal personal interest. You should go for it right here and right now, because there will come a time where it's going to be harder to take risks. Right now, you should absolutely be thinking about what the high risk opportunities that you could pursue are that you'll have the greatest experience with. And so he talks about this a bunch. You're going to take risks. You have no idea. There's no way you could possibly predict if you're going to be successful or not. The important thing is that you're maximizing the speed at which you're learning, and then you're following something that you're just completely obsessed with. In fact, I'll start with this. There's a bunch of other talks that I took notes on that I just, in many cases I spent like hours and hours, and I pull out like one or two lines. There is something that's interesting that he says later on. I'll just bring it to the front now. And he says, this is going to remind you, there's this idea that you and I have talked about over and over again that I think Jeff Bezos puts it into words better than anybody else that I've come across. And he says that you don't choose your passions choose you. And this is what Ken says in a different talk. I've always been interested in the stock market for reasons I don't fully understand. In third grade, I wrote a paper that I wanted to learn how the stock market works. And I've been on that journey now for almost 40 years. So he's okay. You need to be taking risks. What's the highest risk opportunity that you'll have the greatest experience with, that you'll learn the most about, right? And that you're just naturally interested in. He says, I started Citadel right out of college. I joined a firm in Chicago that gave me capital to manage. We had a very simple understanding. If I did well, I'd raise money from outside investors. I would start a formal firm. If things didn't go so well, I'd go back to graduate school. And I think I'm pretty sure I read somewhere, or I heard somewhere, hopefully I'm right about this, that they seeded him with something like $1 million. So, a very small commitment. And I think he had like 70% returns on that money. And so he says that was the deal. And then he talks about why he went to Chicago. I went to Chicago because the two partners that ran the firm that backed me, he talked about one thing he's going to talk about a lot is Ken is a believer in the power of mentorship. So he went to Chicago because he thought the two people that were backing him actually cared about what happened to him, and they took an interest in his career. In fact, this is something that appears over and over again in the books. It's really, really important. It's really one of the miracles of, founders and entrepreneurs. They may be competing with each other when they're alive, but when they get older, they're always willing. I can't think of another example. It's like where they're willing to help the next generation. They're like, oh, that I know all the shit that you had to go through, right? I'm deeper down the path. I want to reach back and help you as much as possible. In fact, I have a book on my desk. This is really important. Another hard to find book It's called Anatomy of a Merger, and it is a book on Jay Pritzker. Now, why was I interested in that? Because Sam Zell was one of the most fascinating entrepreneurs to me. I did his autobiography. I did an episode on his autobiography. Sam Zell listened to that episode, loved it, asked to meet me. Then I got to have a 2-hour lunch with Sam Zell that changed my life. That one conversation really affected and changed my behavior about how I think about things. But Sam talked about it in his book and at lunch that Jay was like 20 years older. Jay Pritzker was like 20 years older than Sam. And in his book, Sam Zell said that Jay was by far the greatest financial mind that he ever came across. And that Jay was so helpful, acted like an older brother and a mentor to him, that changed the trajectory of Sam Zell's career. And, Sam was a legend. So we have Ken Griffin saying, hey, I was a 19-year-old kid. I moved to Chicago, and I did that because the two partners that backed me, they had an interest in me. And he says one of them would remind you of your high school physics teacher. He was plain-spokenly brilliant, and I felt that he would care about my career. And he goes, I think that's really important. Find people that are going to take a vested interest in how you do. So much of your career will come down to mentorship and apprenticeship. And Ken continues, one of the great parts of American culture is the willingness for people intergenerationally to give to those who are younger. So we see this all the time. You and I see this all the time with older founders. They love sharing their knowledge with younger founders. Think about how much we've benefited from, and this usually happens when they're, towards the end of their career, or maybe even after their career, towards the end of their life, and they write these autobiographies. Think of Sam Walton. Think of how influential Sam Walton's autobiography was. He wrote it when he was dying. He knew he was dying. He had cancer, was riddling his body. He was in pain, and yet he took time out, the limited time he had left on this earth, to summarize all the lessons he learned from building one of the greatest companies that the world's ever seen. We benefit so much from this. This is so important. He says, then he talks about some other mentors before, where they were mentors, were the traders and salespeople of Wall Street. So again, I just keep going back to that. I think that story at the very beginning of the blowup of Enron, which he's going to talk about too in this talk, it just gives you an insight. This guy was relentless about seeking information that would be beneficial to his career. So he was mentored by some traders and salespeople on Wall Street. He goes, you have no idea how many hours a day I spent on the phone, like a sponge, learning about finance from those who had 15, 20, 25, 30 years of experience. He even mentions this guy. He goes, Terry O'Connor, Merrill Lynch, Boston. And in the talk, he doesn't have notes in front of him. I watched this many times. He spits out the guy's phone number. He still remembers the guy's phone number. He goes, I could go to Merrill Lynch's office after school, and I'd go there at the end of my school day and stay till midnight. They would let me use their Bloomberg, read the value lines, and read all of their research. And so then after Ken is describing his own experience, he gives advice. Take advantage of all the people in whatever firm you join and in whatever community you're part of to learn from those who simply have more years of experience. Make the most of that. So think about this Founders Podcast is exactly this. We're up to 450 hours, almost 400 books. What are you and I doing every week, right? We're taking advantage and we're learning from those who simply have many more years of experience, and we're making the most of that. So then he continues telling us about his early career. Oh, this was very fascinating, and this is something I see all the time as well. So he says, an acquaintance of mine who has started one of the most successful internet companies of all time said to Ken one day that great entrepreneurs have the right toolkit to solve a problem of that particular moment in time. And so Ken is going to talk about the early days of his career. And this is, he doesn't name who this person is, the successful internet company founder. Great entrepreneurs have the right toolkit to solve a problem of that particular time. You've heard me reference this over and over again on the podcast, that this is the right person with the right set of skills at the right time. So he says, for me, that toolkit was an understanding of software engineering, an understanding of mathematics, a background in economics, and a passion for finance. Remember going back to, hey, I was obsessed with this starting in the third grade. I don't even know why. And a belief that you could use quantitative analytics to have a competitive advantage in the financial markets. This is always fascinating to me. How an insight that no one else has acted on or no one else has mastered yet, which is exactly what he's talking about, right? Eventually will become completely commoditized. It will be obvious to other people. And so that's what he's going to talk about here. And believe it or not, in the 1980s, that was still a reasonably novel thought. One of my earliest hires was a Russian rocket scientist. And one of my friends in Wall Street called me up and said, you're not trying to put a man on the moon. You're trying to make money. And I'm like, no, I believe that this is the future. that those firms that can price derivatives analytically are going to have a real advantage. The guy that called me was a partner at one of the most successful investment banks that no longer exists. And we at Citadel today are one of the largest market makers in the world. So I had the right toolkit in the right moment in time. And I think my friend is really right. So the friend he's talking about is the one that's saying, hey, great entrepreneurs have the right toolkit to solve a problem at that particular moment in time. It's thinking about, this is such great advice. Such great advice. Okay. And I want to go back actually before I go to the great advice. There is something where this idea, I'm going to tell you what came to mind. This idea where he is trying to, he's applying, essentially, if you really think about what he's doing, he's investing in technology. He's applying technology in a way to an existing industry that no one was doing before that. There's a line, that part, when surprisingly enough, when I got to that part of this talk and of the transcript, I thought of Andrew Carnegie. If you go back and read Andrew Carnegie's autobiography, he was doing the same thing he was doing in the 1800s, and he was doing it to the steel industry. He would constantly invest in a ton of money in the latest technology that would help him become more efficient, right? And produce higher quality steel at a lower cost. And these, he calls them like old heads. I can't remember the line he says in his autobiography. These older guys in his existing industry did exactly what this guy who called Ken is like, you're not trying to land on the moon. What are you doing here? They would tell young Andrew Carnegie, this is a waste of money. You shouldn't be doing this. And he knew that the investing in technology was the right move. It made him more efficient. The savings compounded. And then he even says in his autobiography, Carnegie says that in some years, that the efficiency he gained from investing in technology was the difference between profit and loss. And he was able to make a profit where his old head competitors told him not to do that, were making a loss, and they eventually go out of business. So I just think it's fascinating that human nature just, again, history doesn't repeat, human nature does. I love this. Now let's go to this great advice. Excellent. It's thinking about what tools that you have that at this moment unlock problems that just simply didn't exist before. What is your natural skill set that you can apply that remember, take high risks, right? And you can apply that at opportunities that you are uniquely suited to solve right now. And you need to act on it right now, because what if he had that idea? It's like, hey, I think I can get a competitive advantage in the financial markets. If I can use quantitative analytics. And then he waits a decade and a half, or a decade, or maybe even 5 years, maybe even 2 years. That edge that he saw, that novel thought he had, that edge that he thought he could pursue, is competed away. So again, he says everything, and he talks about this, everything we did in the early 90s is completely commoditized. That's just a profound fact. A huge competitive edge in 1990 is just trivial today. And so this is, when I ask people about Ken, another thing that comes up is what he's going to talk about here. That he is just a learning machine, and he's constantly seeking out opportunities, and you can see that he's learning and he's expanding the ways he makes money. He understands that the edges he has, they may not last forever. He just talked about this. It's ridiculous that everything that he thought he was solving, or he did solve, and all the difficulty he went through in the late 80s and the 90s, now you could just literally get for free online. So he says, now the fortuitous part of the story is that over the last 30 years, we've radically improved our business and transformed what we do and how we do things. We continue to build our competitive advantage in the various business in which we choose to compete. That is the essence of running a business. What's the essence of running a business? How do you build your competitive moat? And so by this time, when I'm going back through and doing the transcript to get ready for this episode, I had already read Hardball. And I just wrote, that's exactly what the book Hardball is about. Are you playing to play, or are you playing to win? It's how do you build your competitive moat? We trade financial assets that involve a research process. We need to understand what moves the prices of assets more thoughtfully and more quickly than our competitors. And then trading is simply how we monetize our research. That is how he thinks about what he does. We are just researchers. The glory is in the research, is exactly what he says. He says the glory is in the research. Trading is the monetization of that research. Now, he just got done mentioning the fact that his first edge was competed away. And so the advice he's giving, he's like, you have to. This is just the importance of lifelong, continuous learning. It's related to the fact that his first competitive edge, was commoditized. For all that you've learned so far at Yale, the vast majority of what will matter in your career, you have yet to learn. If you look at the people who have been extraordinarily successful in finance, They are lifetime learners. They are always learning. And so he even talks about the fact that, he was gifted in math at an early age, but eventually he builds a company where he's able to recruit. And there's some crazy numbers. I think there's like 100,000 people that applied to work for Ken last year. And so he knows his own skills as he continues to build his company. Like, he's going to be able to hire people that are better at each individual skill than he is. It's very simple. Remember the episode I did a few weeks ago with Jensen Huang? I can't stop thinking about what the way that Jensen looks at his business. So Jensen's point was like, hey, we're going to have all these like super brilliant, smarter than us AI agents. They're going to go out and be able to actually complete entire jobs for us. People are scared of this. He's like, it's ridiculous to be scared of it because it's my life now. And so what he's talking about, he's like, I have 60 direct reports. Every single one of them is smarter in their respective part of the business than I am. And yet I am able to manage and direct them and essentially direct their activities. He's like, you're going to be doing exactly that, but instead of doing it through people, you'll be doing it through AI agents. So when he's talking about the fact, like, yeah, I used to be good at math, and then I can hire people that are great at math. And he has a funny way to talk about this story. He says, it's funny you speak of me as being mathematically literate. There's a conversation that I had inside Citadel that always makes me smile with one of my absolute top guys. We were going through a particular problem, and he looks at me and he goes, and he says this in front of a room full of people. Yeah, so he looks at Ken and he goes, hey, if you were good at math, this would be much easier to explain. And so he thought that was obviously humorous. He says, my mentors now are my colleagues that I work with, that I choose to surround myself with. What I see inside of our four walls is my sharpest young colleagues gravitate towards people who invest their time with them. In fact, this is another thing that he says. I'm going to read to you. He's asked in another interview that I found, he says, how much, this is going to sound a lot like Steve Jobs, really all the great entrepreneurs understand that it's just talent over everything. He goes, how much time do you spend on recruitment? I am talking to candidates all the time. Nothing is more important than the talent that we're bringing into our four walls. And so he goes back and continues some more advice. You need to find yourself in relationships where somebody takes an interest in you. Now, an interest in you won't always be, he says, let's be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean it's like this big smiling festival, right? Some of the best people that you will work for, you will find to be just incredibly painful to work for. An interest in you does not necessarily mean like, wow, everything you do is great. Sometimes the best advice you get is, here are 4 things that you need to do better. You want to find somebody who's going to push you. Some people push you in a more kind way than others, but you want to find people who are going to push you. So I would say way before I had ever had people, because I had absolutely no network at all, before I started the podcast, I would say, and I think that's true for most people, right? The vast majority are not surrounded. I always talk to some of my friends. It's like, you understand, we're in a bubble inside of a bubble inside of a bubble. If you just look at like the vast majority of humanity, just they don't have access to these networks. Then maybe they can access them online, but they definitely can't access them in person. But biographies can do that. At the very beginning, like when I started reading biographies where he says, hey, you want to find people that push you. I feel that every time I read a biography, like every single person, in my opinion, every single person I've studied on Founders Podcast so far is smarter and more productive than I am. And they're constantly stretching what I believe is possible. They're constantly pushing me and realizing, like, even that story, think about that. If you want to win, right? Everybody wants to win. Like, how bad do you actually want it? And Ken will tell you how bad it is. Like, actions express priority. Actions express priority. How bad did Ken want the information that was inside of Enron's trading department? Like, to the point where he's like, hey, I will come wherever you are and I will get on the plane right now. And he's going to talk about chartering a jet and all this crazy shit that he did to get this information. Then he winds up making like $30 billion, off that information over from then till now. So like, how bad do you want it? So again, I do think like, yeah, you can have people around you that push you. And I definitely now have a network that does that and friends that do that. But even before that, these biographies, just like, dude, I could be doing so much more. What you thought was possible. There's a great line, like, it's mediocrity is always invisible until passion shows up and exposes it. Mediocrity is always invisible until passion shows up and exposes it. The way that Ken goes around running his life, his business, it's full of passion. He's showing you how far you can go. So more advice. If you're in an environment where you've been somewhere for 6 months and you haven't learned much, do not make it 6 months in a day. The most valuable equity that you'll create in your lifetime is your career equity that you own. It's really think about your education, your skills. It doesn't go up and down with the market. You own that equity and you want to think about how to maximize your career equity, because that toolkit that you develop over your career That's your ultimate job security. That's your ultimate ticket to success. Another piece of advice that Ken has here, really, I'm going to read this Warren Buffett quote that came to mind first, because this is exactly what he's talking about. So Warren Buffett says, "A rising tide floats all boats. Only when the tide goes out do you discover who has been swimming naked." Ken will reference multiple times the fact that Citadel almost went out of business completely during the great financial crisis from 08 to 07 to 08. He says when you're in a firm in difficult moments, you actually see in well-managed firms, you see what real leadership looks like, what real leadership teams are actually made of. It's much like when the rising tide lifts all boats. Poorly run firms and great run firms, it's sometimes hard to distinguish between the two. But when times are tough is when you really see the character of the firm. Again, this is why I always say that time is the only filter that I trust. There's another great piece of advice that Warren Buffett gives. He's like, listen, I don't really believe in formulas, but I tell all the managers of our wholly owned businesses, it's like a three-step formula. It's like make every decision as if you own 100% of your company, as if it's the only asset that your family owns or will ever own, and then you can't sell it for 100 years. And if you run your decision-making process through that rubric, you're optimizing for long-term survival, right? Time is the only filter that I trust. So what's interesting is the number of people that I know that started their careers during the 07, 08, 09, and they started in finance, who have this just incredible perspective. So he is talking about the fact that adversity is an asset. And that's something that also Ken has in common with a lot of history's greatest entrepreneurs. So he's like, okay, well, if you started your career then, right, you're going through hell at the very beginning. And he says later on, now we're 13 years later, 15 years later, whatever time is, the people that had to go and had to survive that adversity, decade and a half later, they are remarkably wise and well-grounded and able to navigate moments of adversity as if it's a walk in the park because they've been through a difficult time. First thing that popped to my mind when I got to that part, it's like, oh, this is like Rockefeller. Rockefeller praised the benefits of adversity all of his life. In fact, he said, what a school, the school of adversity and stress to train a boy in. He's talking about himself. Another great line, D. Hawk, the founder of Visa, has this great maxim. He says, the wise make great use of adversity. The foolish whine about it. And so Ken's going to keep talking about that. And he says, I say at Citadel, we forge talent. That implies a concept of pressure. The world also forges talent. And those difficult moments give people almost extraordinary opportunities to make decisions in the most difficult of times and to have a very fast rate of development and growth. And then he talks about the opposite. When times are good, what happens? It makes you soft. And so he's talking about it on a country level. And again, I think the benefit of watching the interview, then obviously transcribing and reading it at the same time I read Hardball, you see how the way he thinks is connected. There's ideas. You could see why he recommends that book, I guess is what I'm saying. So he's talking about, hey, in the United States, we have a really big problem. We've been, after post-World War II, the United States really had no competitors. That has shifted in the last 15 years. And he talks about this report that really bothered him when he was reading it. He says this report was published in Australia. There was a survey of roughly 45 of the most important emerging technologies, from quantum computing to solar power cells to various areas in biotechnology, and the Chinese led in 30 of these areas. That is really frightening now in the United States. The United States is so entrenched in this unshakable belief that we cannot be challenged in technology, oblivious to the fact that not only are we being challenged, we're being beaten. And so if you read Hardball, there's a great line that I just sent to a friend of mine who's dealing with this with a massive organization. And there's a line from Hardball. It says, when an organization, Ken's talking about, it could be a company, obviously in the example he just gave, it could be a country. When an organization achieves advantage, it develops a tendency to continue operating with the same strategy that produced the advantage. It is the leader's main role to keep alive the quest for advantage. And so then we get to the part where Ken talks about almost going out of business. He says, there's a little saying, a little quip that I like to make. History is written by the winners. So the wonderful history of Citadel is how we are the most profitable hedge fund of all time. The chapter of how we were on the verge of going out of business in 08 is now a footnote in that book, but it is a very important note. It has not been an easy march to success. I think I have the most interesting position in life. I've probably lost, and my team has probably lost, more money than any other firm in existence. We just happen to have made more money than almost any other firm in existence. And it's the net that everyone talks about. There are years where our losses are hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't know if it's hundreds, but it's over 100. The number is incomprehensible. It's also why it's really important, like who's interviewing the person or who gets to ask the questions. There's so many times during this. It's like if I was the one talking to Ken, I'm like, wait, pause. Can you explain that? How did you lose $100 billion in a year? And no disrespect to the guy, asking the questions. There's multiple times where I'm like, no, like, I just think I could do a better job. I guess is what I'm saying. No disrespect to him, but I want to know more about what, like, how the hell do you lose $100 billion in a year? It says the numbers are incomprehensible. But this is the main point. I didn't mean to distract our conversation. All of my losses are my tuition, and I have the most expensive education in American history. If every time you lost money, you got depressed and angry, and you couldn't deal with it, you'd have a very short career. So you need to be able to take a step back and go, it's a tuition bill I paid. This doesn't mean that you don't think very long and hard about what went wrong, but you have to keep it in perspective. In 2008, that tuition bill almost became getting expelled from school because we lost half our equity in 16 weeks in a firm that had never had a double-digit drawdown in 20 years. Now, this is another example. He says he's always going to like the scene of the crime, I think is how he puts this. I absolutely love the fact that he did this. The principal reason that we survived is that when long-term capital management failed in 1998. So 1998, Ken would be 30 when he's doing what he's about to describe here. In 2008, when he almost goes out of business, he's 40, okay? So he's like, this is the reason that we were able to survive 10 years later. Because back in 1998, I went and met with a number of the senior people that worked at long-term capital management. And why did I do this? What was my agenda? I wanted to understand, how does a firm that loses 90% of its equity in a levered financial service industry still stay in business? They lost 90% of their equity before they lost control of their business. And much of what we learned from how they survived was actually fundamentally and existentially important to our ability to withstand the turmoil of 2008. So there's a very important lesson here, which is not only do you want to learn from your mistakes, you really want to learn from the other guys and the other people's mistakes too, because they're much cheaper tuition bills. So a few episodes ago, I think it's episode 380 on Buffett and Munger. It's 400 pages of Buffett and Munger in their own words. They said this exact same thing. In fact, they quoted Patton. I think Buffett's the one that said this. He says, the best thing to do is learn from the other guy's mistakes. George Patton used to say, it's an honor to die for your country. Make sure the other guy gets the honor. And so this is another great idea that Ken has here. I've spent over my lifetime a lot of time at the proverbial scene of accidents where other firms have gone awry. And so now he's going to talk about what we talked about at the very beginning. When Enron filed for bankruptcy, Enron was the largest energy trading firm in the United States, and they blew apart spectacularly in 2001. So that means around this time that Ken would have been around 33 years old when he's doing this. So that story we told at the beginning. The day they filed for bankruptcy, I chartered a Gulfstream jet and put 16 people on it straight to Houston. And all we did was interview people at Enron for several days. The day, not the day after, not a week, let's wait a month. He says the day I chartered a jet, got and went down there. Again, hardball. He's playing. It's very obvious that Ken plays. He's not playing to play. He's playing to win, and he wants a landslide. All we did was interview people at Enron for several days. What worked, what didn't work, how they made money, how they ran their business, what their competitive advantage was. Now, the great part of this story is I hired the entire leadership team of the quantitative research effort at Enron, all the people who actually knew how the place worked. And we've made $30 billion in commodities since then. So he calls this being on the ground. That's about being on the ground. That's about understanding where the business actually created value. That's about extracting the right people from that moment in time and surrounding them with the right leadership team, the right investment professionals, the right software engineers, and building what is today one of the most important commodity businesses in the world. So going back to our 2008 experience, the first point is when, this is hilarious, is when you're walking through hell, just put one foot in front of the other. Just keep going. I was praying that we would find our way out of the fire. And he goes, why do I use this fire analogy. I called Lloyd Blankfein, who ran Goldman Sachs at the time, and I said, Lloyd, when is this going to end? And he goes, a forest fire ends when there's nothing left to burn. He said, that did not make me feel a lot better. But we never gave up during that period of time. And so when you're going through hell, he has a piece of advice for you. Make sure you push your decision-making to those who are mentally in the game in the right way. Because some people just, if it's their first adversity, they're like the proverbial deer in the headlights. So I was thinking about this, where adversity is an asset. He's going to talk about the importance of reps later on. He's seen so much in his 40-year career in finance. So when he's talking about this, like, people are going through hell. There's some people who are just like completely freaked out, and some people are cool and calm and collected. You have to push the decision-making to those who are mentally in the game in the right way. This is where who you surround yourself really matters, because when you surround yourself with the right team, you will buttress each other on your darkest days. And he talks about some people just are going to struggle with stress and adversity. Other people are going to prosper. In fact, one of my favorite lines I've ever heard of any founder ever, and I think it's the right mentality, is Herb Kelleher was the founder of Southwest Airlines. Didn't start Southwest, so he's like in his mid-30s. I think he was like 35. And he winds up for the next 40 years just completely kicking all his competitors' asses. And he was asked by an interviewer one time, you undergo a lot of stress all the time. How do you handle it? And Herb's answer was perfect. I don't handle it. I like it. Entrepreneurs are seeking stress. You're seeking challenge. You're seeking problems that you can solve that no one else can solve. And if you can't deal with stress, then you just can't do this job. What Ken's about to say here, I think he has a common with a lot of history's greatest entrepreneurs, is their main sources of stress are not external. It's the pressure and expectations they put on themselves. It comes from within. And he says, my biggest stressor, that's me. I'm always trying to figure out how I can be better, how I can do better. I might be demanding of the people that work for me, but I am no less demanding of myself. And so one of my favorite stories to ever tell is I'm watching this interview with Kobe Bryant, and Ahmad Rashad asked him, like, how do you deal with fans' expectations? And before Ahmad could even finish his sentence, Kobe makes the stanky face. He's just like, ugh, just like complete disgust a look of disgust takes over his entire face. He immediately interrupts Ahmad Rashad, and he says, their expectations will never be higher than my own. Never, never, never. I think it's exactly what Ken says. I think a lot of history's greatest is like, if other people's expectations of you are higher than your own, you're probably, again, not in the right job. And so one reason that entrepreneurship is full of stress, I love this idea that Mark Andreessen said one time, that you only ever feel two emotions, euphoria and terror, and nothing in between. And part of the reason that there's a lot of terror and uncertainty and, stress and discomfort, and I loved Herb Kelleher's perspective that you should just think of that as a good thing. It's like, I don't manage it, I like it. I don't handle it, I like it. Is you're constantly making decisions under uncertainty. Like, that is the job. And so he's going to talk a lot about that. You have to get used to, and you have to understand that part of the job is making decisions under uncertainty. He says, good leadership is about acknowledging that I'm going to make decisions under uncertainty. And people who are very good at business are very good at understanding the process is what matters. Do I make decisions with a well-framed and thought-out process? People get in trouble when they start to become reductionists. Like, if I do X, Y is going to happen. Very little in business is actually that straightforward. And so he gives an example about the fact that you're working in this constantly evolving and changing environment. You can't survive over. Citadel was founded, what was that, 40 years ago? Citadel Securities, I think 5 years ago. So, he's seen a lot in that time. And his example is like, okay, well, how many retailers had a mobile strategy in 2004 before the iPhone? He said, no one. The world around you is going to be constantly changing, and you need to leave yourself in a position to be more psychologically flexible and, to be clear, financially flexible to deal with evolving change. And if you do that, you have a much higher chance of being a survivor. So you have to leave yourself to be psychologically flexible and financially flexible to deal with evolving change. There's a great line, and as far as like the changing technology, there's this interview that Steve Jobs does in this book called In the Company of Giants. I think it's episode 208, where these Stanford MBA students interview like 16 or 17, I think 16 technology company leaders at the time. So like Michael Dell's in there, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, all these other people as well. And Steve's point was like, I don't know. Remember, he's saying this in 97. He goes, I don't know what the next big thing is. I just know there will be a next big thing. And so he is he was psychologically and financially flexible to deal with that. But the greatest example of this that came to mind when I read what Ken was saying here comes from Henry Singleton. Henry Singleton, Charlie Munger said Henry Singleton was the smartest person he ever met. Buffett says that it's a crime that more business schools don't study him, that he put up one of the greatest records in American business history. One of Singleton's main ideas was like, hey, I'm going to maintain flexibility. I'm going to steer the boat a little bit every single day. And so as once criticized for not having a business plan, Henry replied that he knew a lot of people running companies that had very definitive plans that they followed assiduously. But this is a direct quote from Henry now, but we're subject to a great number of outside influences on our business, and most of them cannot be predicted. So my plan is to stay flexible. My only plan is to keep coming to work every day. I like to steer the boat each day rather than plan way ahead into the future. So back to Ken, you have a much higher chance of being a survivor if you're financially and psychologically flexible. And then he gives us an example that should terrify you. You do not want to wind up like these people. I keep going back to this main point that in my 50s and even my 40s, I would have friends or contemporaries who you saw got off the learning treadmill and life just passed them by. And it doesn't pass them by in 20 years. It passes them by in 5 or 10. They stop learning. They lost their edge. It's really important if you're not finding yourself learning and growing as a leader and as a domain expert in your field that you pursue, you've got to move on. The other thing I would say is that if the field that you chose to pursue ultimately inspires no passion, you need to move on also. Because if you're not passionate about the field you're engaged in, you won't have the grit or perseverance to compete with those who are. And does that not repeat over and over again in these biographies that you and I go over? You could say passion. I definitely think that's a word. Another way to think about that too, which I think is very similar, is Charlie Munger has this quote that he says, another thing that I found is that intense interest in any subject is indispensable if you're going to excel in it. So think about that. It's like, if you don't have this in the field that you're engaged in, you're not going to have the grit or perseverance to compete with those who are. Think about Todd Graves. Go back to, built a $10 billion company. And one of the greatest things about that episode that I did a week or two ago was the fact that he's asked, like, he's in his case, he's competing with in his industry, he's competing with a lot of essentially corporate-owned companies. There's no founder-led companies that he's competing with, and so that's why he's just trouncing them all. One of the reasons he's trouncing them, and he says, I don't fear the big corporate guys. I'm not worried that McDonald's is going to come and destroy me. What I'm worried about is the young guy that has the same hunger that I had, that wants to compete head to head with me. But then he makes this warning where he's like, that's fine, but understand that I love competing. He goes, and I'm on this day and night. Are you? That's an interesting question to ask yourself. And again, I've tried to maneuver myself into a position where I don't think there's anybody in the planet that is more passionate, more interested in working harder on what I am on this exact thing. I don't care about anything else, but I will collect more information and I will keep doing this on History's Greatest Entrepreneurs than anybody else in the world. And I'm glad if somebody wants to jump in, but like, I'm on this day and night. I told you in the Todd Graves episode, I was laughing to myself when I was preparing for the episode and I looked at the clock. It was Saturday night at 9:05 p.m. I didn't want to do anything else. I didn't want to go out. I want to work on this podcast. And the people that I respect and admire the most, and the people I try to learn from, is like, they're like, I'm on this, that whatever I am interested in, I am more interested in it than almost anybody else in the world. And certainly more than anybody else that I know of. And I think that's a great line. Again, let's go back to that. Like, I'm on this day and night, are you? Go back to that idea. If you don't have this intense interest in what you're working on, right? You're not going to have the grit or perseverance to compete with those who are. Think about the very beginning, that story he told. And I'm pretty, like, this guy was wildly successful, but he's like, listen, I started with a niche fund and I burnt out after 17 years. Ken started with a niche, built one of the most successful financial firms ever, and he's never tired. He's still on it. All right, so let's go back to this. So Ken says, this is very fascinating too. Success is elusive. However you climb, success is probably twice as far. That was told to me by one of our friends who's one of the most successful people in the history of finance. When he's asked, what is success? His answer is, it's twice what I've accomplished. That is a pretty daunting concept. And he noticed another thing about the most successful people that he knows, and it's definitely true for him. It's really important that you hit the ground running and you run really hard early in life. There's great stories where Ken had convinced Harvard to install like a satellite dish, and I think it was the first person ever, on his dorm so he can get real-time information so he could trade all these options and all these financial instruments that he was trading. You know, he starts Citadel at 19. He's going to Ed Thorp's house and pulling out boxes and boxes of data from Princeton Newport Partners. And his whole point is just like, all the stuff that you're doing, yeah, life might be long, but it compounds. The skill set and the knowledge you have, like, don't like, oh, I have time. Like, no, just work as fast as possible. There's no doubt that in your 20s and 30s, your rate of learning is astronomically high. There's a much stronger focus, and he's talking about the issue of something he brings up over and over again that I'm kind of skipping over, but I'll just kind of fill it in for you. He's very concerned about American competitiveness and that we're not working as hard as the young people are not working as hard. He says there's a much stronger focus on gratification in the here and now. And great companies, great anything. It takes time. Now, perfect example. Citadel was founded 35 years ago. Citadel Securities was founded 23 years ago. His best and most profitable years have come in the last like 3 to 4. So 25 years into his fund is the most successful years. Same thing we see this over and over again. This is something that Peter Thiel realized, that the problem a lot of technology company entrepreneurs is they optimize for growth at the expense of durability. But if you actually look at when these companies make the most money, it's like 10, 20, 30 years into the future. So that takeaway was like, you don't want to optimize for growth at the expense of durability, because you want to be around 2, 3, 4 decades from now to reap all those rewards that are so much greater than the ones you'll get early in your career. And so it's like you can't just be like, oh, I have to be really, really rich in like a year or two, because it's highly likely what you think is really, really rich, right, will seem like a drop in the bucket if your company is successful and you're still running it 3 or 4 decades from now. In fact, a friend of mine was showing me revenue numbers. He was texting me this last night. In 2017, I think his company did $8 million in revenue, and this year it'll do close to $200 million. And one of my texts back to him is something that I've noticed. It's very obvious if you read all these biographies. Like, things grow in mysterious ways. Your job is to get into a great business and stay there. That's exactly what Ken did. So I'm all over the map. Let me go back to this on hitting the ground running and running hard. Okay, so great companies, great anything, take time. It's not clear to me how this is going to play out, because what I see is that people that had really intense careers early on just tend to go so much farther over the ensuing 20 or 30 years. This idea of late bloomers in careers, yeah, it happens, but I think it's pretty infrequent. I think it's important to hit the ground running and to run pretty hard. So there's a bunch of founders that I've profiled that got their break or their big break later in life. So Estee Lauder, Sam Walton, Ray Kroc. But I think Ken is dead right about this. If you look at what they were doing when they were in their 20s, they weren't just like sitting around waiting for inspiration. They were honing their skills. They just were waiting for the right opportunity. So Estee Lauder, she started her company as a 40-year-old stay-at-home mom. But for 25 years before that, she was obsessed with making these potions. And essentially, she was running her business. Before running her business, she was making these skincare, these beauty routines, and giving it away for free and bothering all the people around her sister, her mom, everybody she ran into. She was doing the job before she had the job. Same thing with Sam Walton. Same thing with Ray Kroc. They were hitting the ground. They were running. They just didn't unlock their greatest opportunity for a decade or two. If the work isn't really satisfying, go find somewhere else to run. That is a great line. Go find somewhere else to run. Because if you're not running and it's not satisfying, where do you think you're going to be in 20 years? Where are you going to be? You're going to be miserable and unhappy is where you're going to be. So again, this is another, the Todd Graves episode on Raising Cane's I did, very well received. A lot of people are listening to it. What's interesting, like these guys get some random comments online. Like, I can't believe this guy dedicated his life mission to, making the best chicken fingers, and as if that was a bad thing. And my response is like, most people never even find a mission in life. What are you talking about? I'm just glad I don't care what other people's mission is. I'm just glad he has one. The vast majority of people that have ever lived and died never even had a mission. And the pursuit of that mission is going to be difficult. It's going to cause stress. But I think it is fundamental. Like the humans with missions, even if they have to go through a lot of stress and adversity, will be much more satisfied when they're looking back on their life. In fact, there's a great line. I found this biography. It's really hard to find. It's on Bugatti. And the founder of Bugatti, his daughter writes the book. I think it's published in 1960. I want to pull this line up because she's quoting somebody else, but I think it's excellent. It's really talking about the fact that just try to find work that's satisfying, that you can do for a long time. And this is a description of Bugatti's, passed away at the time that his daughter's writing this book. And she finds this quote, and she's, it sounds to her like what her father was. It says, a human life, by its very nature, has to be devoted to something or other, to a glorious or humble enterprise, an illustrious or obscure destiny. This is the strange but inexorable condition of things. So I think it's exactly what he's saying. Because listen, if you're not running and you're not satisfying, where do you think you're going to be in 20 years? Where are you going to be? You're going to be miserable and unhappy is where you're going to be. I read the biography of George Lucas, which is remarkable. It's by Brian J. Jones. It's called George Lucas: A Life. What's remarkable about that is how much struggle. Everybody knows, oh yeah, this guy sold his company for $5 billion. He invented Star Wars and all this stuff. You didn't see that he was obsessed with building a life that he was in charge of, that was dedicated to a mission, and all the struggle, the debt that he had to go into. He was in credit card debt. He was borrowing money from friends. And even when he was doing this, he was talking about the contrast between the path that he's pursuing in life and how most people they wouldn't even take the risk. They'll just sit there in jobs they fucking hate. And this is what George Lucas said in 1971. People would give anything to quit their jobs. All they have to do is do it. They're people in cages with open doors. Let's go back to what Ken is saying here. If your work is actually engaging and exciting, you're going to look back on the first 10 years of that journey and say, you know what? I worked really hard, but we did some really amazing things, and I'm really proud of. I think doing work that you're proud of is really, really important to the satisfaction that we're going to draw out of life. Now we're going back into this idea that great takes time. Things grow in, mysterious ways. Citadel founded 35 years ago. Citadel Securities founded 23 years ago. And yet, 23 and 35 years into his business, we have 100,000 applicants for positions this year. We've never had so many people looking to work at our firm. So then at this point in the talk, he starts taking questions from audience members. One of these questions was, okay, you have to, there's these unknown, unknowable, and highly uncertain future that we all have to navigate. Many of the decisions we're making, they're decisions based on judgment rather than facts. Like, at what point in your career did you feel you were able to develop the ability to comfortably make those judgments? And Ken has a great line here. He goes, it was the quantity of decisions made. Steve Jobs said something very similar when everybody talked about how great his taste was. And he said taste was a byproduct of the number of decisions he made. Again, he gave this interview with Michael Moritz. It's on the Steve Jobs Archive website, which if you haven't checked out, it's run by Steve's widow. It's excellent. He says, this is what Steve says, things get more refined as you make mistakes. I've just had a chance to make a lot of mistakes. Your aesthetics get better as you make mistakes. So Ken says it's the quantity of decisions made. And to be clear, the more decisions of a similar nature you can make, the better at those decisions you become. So when we think about business activities far away from our core, I get much more anxious. Decisions within our core, I think we make pretty easily and pretty fluidly. It is repetition of the type of decision. Reps matter. If you go through my notes, you'll see I'm constantly in the notes and the highlights that I accumulate through the research for the podcast. I see that over and over again. The shorthand I have is reps, reps, reps. You see this over and over again. Quantity, reps matter. It's the repetition of the type of decision. So then he's asked how he decides which new businesses to pursue. He says total addressable market matters. Why does it matter? Because the odds that you get everything right to launch a successful product, those odds are not high. So when it all comes together, you want there to be something at the end of the rainbow. Think about the total addressable market of the product or business that you're going to pursue. The markets that we're in are deep, liquid markets. That means that when we do our research right, we can monetize it because we can get the liquidity to express that view. We want to be in deep, liquid markets. And then in the middle of this answer to this question, I think he gives one of the most important pieces of advice during this entire talk, or really most important piece of advice that anybody can give, is that entrepreneurship is sales, and you better damn well get comfortable selling. He says you're always selling. When the guy that backed me out of college retired from Chicago, he said I could have whatever I wanted from his office. I took a plaque that probably cost $9.99, and that plaque said, "If we're gonna eat, someone's got to sell." That is a great line. If we're gonna eat, somebody's got to sell. That is the story of being an entrepreneur, and that is the story of being a CEO. If we're all going to eat, somebody's got to sell. Every CEO is a salesperson. They've got to sell a venture capital firm. They've got to sell a customer. They have to sell an employee. You are always selling. And if you don't like to sell, here's my advice. Get over it. I had no interest in selling when I was 20 years old. This is hilarious. So he's 20 years old. He's trying to raise money for his fund, right? He says, I was in a conference room in 1994 in Switzerland trying to raise money. Let me tell you about this bad trip. I show up for lunch and the guy I meet with goes, you're not John Griffin. And I said, no, I'm Ken Griffin. And he goes, I thought you were John Griffin. John Griffin was at Blue Ridge at the time. He goes, I thought you were John Griffin. I need to go. Well, great. I just flew all the way to Switzerland to have my lunch walk out on me. Then I get to another meeting later that day, and we were doing convertible bond arbitrage. And in 1994, that was a tough space to be in. And I'm in this beautiful office in Switzerland, and this guy is just smoking his cigar, puff, puff, puff. So Ken does his pitch. At the end, the guy goes, so sad, such a bright young man, picked the wrong career. My point is, you've got to be able to play through these moments. And then the last comment he has, this is where he's recommending all these books. He's talking about the importance of playing hardball, about playing to win. And he's talking about really having the ability, like going through this experience in life. And this is really what, Founders Podcast is doing. This is like, you want to learn not just from your competition, not just from inside your business, but you can grab all these ideas from businesses and industries that are far afield of where you are. And he gives a great example of this. So first, he's talking about all these books that he likes. And he goes, another book that's out of print is Hardball. It's really fun to read. Hardball is just great. In business, you don't play to win. You play to win by a landslide. If you don't win by a landslide, then your competitors come back. And come back and beat you. Again, when I think of this, this is the way Ken thinks. But Jeff Bezos has a line that's almost exactly like this. Jeff says, when it comes to competition, being one of the best is not good enough. That is how I would describe. It's almost like a one-sentence summary of Hardball. Being one of the best is not good enough. You want to be the best. So it says, when it comes to competition, being one of the best is not good enough. Do you really want to plan for a future in which you might have to fight with somebody who is just as good as you are? I wouldn't. That's Bezos. Think about how Bezos built Amazon, right? He played hardball, just like Ken Griffin. Ken gives another example of somebody playing hardball. He talks about Michael Dell. It says, Michael Dell of Dell Computer. He manufactured computers in America and won. Think about how well he ran the business to do that. The next episode is actually going to be on Michael Dell. Michael Dell sent me the greatest DM I've ever got in my life. He DM'd me and he says, your podcasts are A++, and a bunch of like trophy emojis. It's just incredible. I couldn't believe it. But I've read 2 books on Michael Dell, and I'm going to do an episode. The next episode is going to be on his second autobiography, which is fantastic. If you want to start reading that now, I highly recommend. And he reads the audiobook too, which I've listened to like 3 times. Excellent. So it says, think about how hard or how well he ran the business to do that. He says, you're going to do this for the rest of your life. So you want to study successful businesses, even if they're far afield of what you do. And so he says, I have a story that you'll love. You'll love this. We built a risk wall in Chicago at the headquarters of Citadel, okay? Before we built this risk wall, it was written that we had a B quality risk management. So everything you've heard about Ken so far, he's not going to be accepted. He's not going to find getting a B on something acceptable, okay? So decide to build a risk wall. What is a risk wall? It's this giant screen in their headquarters. It's 30 feet long, 10 feet high, and they rendered all the risk information in one place in this giant visual, and then put it where everybody has to see it, right? And so he says, we went from getting a B to being an industry leader. He says, packaging matters. Where did the idea for the risk wall come from? It came because he went to Saudi Aramco's headquarters in Saudi Arabia, okay? He says this is where they oversee their production from their oil fields. They have this giant wall on all the important data of their business is what he's telling us here, okay? They oversee their production from their oil fields, the output from their power plants, the ships on the open sea, and looking at that visualization and seeing how powerful that was. And I said, you know what? What if I render all of our risk numbers that same way? You always need to think like an entrepreneur. You always need to think, how do you create advantages and how do you learn not just from your competitors, but from businesses far afield from where you are? And when you do this, a lot of interesting and fun things happen that you can learn from and incorporate. And that is where I'll leave it. I will leave a link down below if you want to watch the full talk. I will also leave a link down below in case you want to grab that book that he recommends called Hardball. If you haven't yet joined my personal email list, make sure you do that. That link will be down below, and it's also available at davidsenra.com. I email the top 10 highlights from every single book that I read. That is 384 down, 1,000 to go, and I'll talk to you again soon. Real quick before you go, I need to tell you the update to Founders Notes. There is now a monthly option, and I brought back the lifetime option by popular request. If you subscribe to Founders Notes, you'll get access to all of my notes and highlights. That's over 20,000 notes and highlights on history's greatest founders. You can search through all of them by keyword, or you can have the AI assistant that I built for Founders Notes, which is called Sage, read everything and summarize it for you. I use Sage almost every day. It's actually a tool that I built for myself. So when you subscribe to Founders Notes, you see exactly what I see. It's the same exact tool that I use. Jensen Huang, the founder of NVIDIA, said that in the future, everyone will have a virtual assistant, almost like a brilliant intern with near perfect memory, capable of instantly recalling any piece of knowledge. Sage is that now. The future is already here, except Sage is hyper-focused on the collective knowledge of history's greatest entrepreneurs. So if you have access to Sage, you then have access to all that collective knowledge on demand. I really believe you should be using it to supplement the decisions that you make in your work. And you can do that by going to foundersnotes.com. That is founders with an S, just like the podcast. So that's foundersnotes.com. And the link is also down below and available at founderspodcast.com.